A rich boy meets a beggar who looks exactly like him. What his mother says next will blow your mind. Watch until the end, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The world that Donye Brooks inhabited was not merely a home. It was a fortress of perfection, designed to project power, polish, and prestige. Nestled within a gated community in one of the most affluent corners of the city, the Brooks estate spanned more land than the city park a few blocks away. The mansion, a towering structure of glass, stone, and ivory-colored stucco, seemed to gleam even under the gray veil of winter sky. It had been featured in architecture magazines, admired for its symmetry, luxury, and technological sophistication. Inside, every floor sparkled, every surface was dustless, and every item had a designated place. It was a place where nothing unexpected ever happened. Donye Brooks was 11 years old, and as polished in manners and appearance as the floors beneath his designer sneakers. His tightly coiled hair was cut precisely, his school uniforms always pristine. Every morning, a hired stylist ensured his skin glowed and his curls were shaped, though Donye often wished he could just sleep through it all. He had every toy a child could dream of, and every gadget that hadn't yet reached the shelves of ordinary stores. But none of it ever seemed to matter much. He lived in a world built by others and operated by a staff so professional and invisible they may as well have been ghosts. His meals arrived on time, his clothes folded with surgical precision, his room maintained like a museum exhibit. Yet, in all the order, Donye often felt like a museum piece himself, displayed but untouched, admired but alone. His parents, Jonathan and Audriana Brooks, were two of the city's most powerful people. His father, an aggressive and ever-present figure in business headlines, ran a multi-million-dollar real estate and development empire. His mother, Senator Audriana Brooks, spent her days in the state legislature chambers, giving interviews, attending fundraisers, and preparing for what many whispered could be a run for Congress. At home, they were less like parents and more like statues carved into the corners of his life, always present but never quite reachable. When Donye thought of family, he thought first of Harriet, his full-time nanny, or perhaps Miriam, the cook who remembered he hated celery, but never really of his parents. That Thursday morning began like most others. The sun shone softly through the tinted glass windows of his bedroom as Donye sat at his desk, barely touching his breakfast tray. A perfectly cut grapefruit stared back at him untouched. He poked it with his spoon, sighed, and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the manicured garden lay in stillness. He imagined himself running barefoot across the lawn, like he'd seen children do in movies. No shoes, no rules. But in the Brooks house, you didn't run, you didn't yell, you didn't even laugh loudly. His ride to school was in a glossy black luxury SUV with dark tinted windows, driven by Thomas, who never spoke unless spoken to. The school itself was a private academy so exclusive that every student came from families with names known to tabloids or stock markets. Donye excelled there. His handwriting was flawless, his math scores nearly perfect. But he never felt he belonged. He watched other children form cliques, joke loudly in hallways, make inside jokes he wasn't part of. Most of the kids either wanted something from him or were too intimidated to talk to him like a normal boy. It was after school, while returning home through the quieter edge of the downtown district, that Donye's world gave its first unexpected jolt. The SUV slowed at a red light beside a run-down strip of shuttered storefronts, some with broken windows, others boarded up. He rarely paid attention to this stretch. It was considered unpleasant. But that day, something pulled at his eyes. There, near the corner of a closed laundromat, sat a boy on the sidewalk. He looked no older than Donier himself. He wore a threadbare hoodie, pants too short for his legs, and sneakers so worn they seemed barely attached to his feet. In his hands, a piece of cardboard with hastily scribbled words, "Hungry, please help." He wasn't calling out, wasn't shaking a cup. He simply sat still, eyes half lowered as the world walked past him. But it wasn't the sign that caught Donier's attention. It was the boy's face. He stared, heart kicking in his chest. The SUV's engine rumbled quietly beneath him, but Donier barely noticed. The boy, on the sidewalk, he looked exactly like him. Not just a little or kind of. No, it was as if he were staring into a mirror smeared with dirt and pain. The same eyes, deep brown and wide set, the same arch of eyebrows, even the shape of the jaw. It wasn't a trick of lighting or a coincidence. "Thomas," Donier said, sitting forward. "Stop the car." "Sir?" the driver replied, glancing into the rearview mirror. "Stop. The car. I need to—" Before he could finish, the light turned green, and the SUV rolled forward smoothly, leaving the corner and the boy behind. Donier twisted in his seat, straining to look out the rear window, but the boy had already disappeared from view. The rest of the ride home passed in silence. Donier barely noticed the polished marble steps as he entered the house or the soft greeting from Harriet. He skipped his after-school snack and retreated to his room. He couldn't get the boy's face out of his head. It haunted him in a way no ghost ever could. That boy hadn't just looked like him. He had been him, in another life, another skin, another fate. That night, Donier barely slept. He tossed beneath his silk sheets, staring at the ceiling. He rose at dawn and rifled through the old family photo albums in the study, something he'd never done without supervision. There were baby pictures of him in the hospital, held by Audriana, kissed on the head by Jonathan. But something in the back of one of the albums made his fingers freeze. An ultrasound, black and white, faded. He held it closer. 2 shapes. 2. He blinked, heart pounding. His name was printed neatly on the label below, along with the date. But no mention of another child. At breakfast, he studied his mother's face. Audriana smiled between phone calls and bites of toast. She looked perfect, as always, but behind her eyes he saw the shadows of something else. She had always been loving in theory, buying the right gifts, attending the occasional school recital, but she had never told him bedtime stories, never mentioned his birth beyond vague, sterilized anecdotes. After school, as the SUV approached the same intersection, Donier craned his neck. The boy wasn't there. That evening, after homework and his allotted hour of tablet time, Donier asked Harriet quietly, "Did I ever cry with someone when I was a baby?" Harriet blinked. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I mean, was I ever not alone?" The woman paused, her brow furrowing. "Well, I suppose all babies cry in nurseries. You might have been with others then." "No," he insisted, "at home." She hesitated. "There were a few times I thought I heard you babbling like you were with someone else. But maybe it was the monitor acting up. It's been so long." Donier's thoughts raced. The ultrasound, the face, the sudden chill in his mother's eyes when he'd asked about his birth months ago, and she'd changed the subject. Something was hidden, something important. That night, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would go back to that street, alone if necessary. He needed to see that boy again, needed to talk to him, needed to understand. Because the face he saw on that sidewalk wasn't just familiar. It was his. And for the first time in his carefully polished, tightly scheduled, perfectly controlled life, Donye Brooks felt something burn inside him, something wild, urgent, and impossible to ignore. A longing not for toys or praise or medals, but for truth. The wind rattled through the alley behind the shuttered supermarket, its chill biting deeper than the thin, torn hoodie that wrapped around Mikhail's slender frame. He huddled beneath a rusted metal awning that once covered a loading dock, his knees tucked into his chest, arms wrapped tightly around his legs. The ground beneath him was rough and cold, the concrete scarred by age, the grime of the city's neglect soaked into every crack. A flattened cardboard box served as his bed. The night before, he'd added an extra layer of newspaper he found in a trash bin. It hadn't helped. Mikhail was 11 years old, though he looked closer to 9, his bones light, his frame wiry, his cheeks slightly sunken from hunger. His skin was dark and dulled by dust, and his hands bore the calluses of life lived too long without protection. His shoes, mismatched and held together by strips of plastic, were soaked from the rain that had poured 2 nights ago. But none of that made him cry. Mikhail rarely cried. Life on the street didn't allow for softness. He shifted beneath the awning, pressing his back against the cold wall behind him as he listened to the distant hum of traffic. Morning was coming. He knew the signs. The shadows changed shape, the air smelled different, and the street sweepers began their slow, mechanical descent through the blocks of forgotten buildings. Soon, the corner where he usually sat with his cardboard sign would fill with pedestrians, some indifferent, some hostile, a rare few sympathetic enough to drop a crumpled dollar bill or an unopened granola bar. He would go there, as always. He would sit, hold the sign, look down, and pretend he wasn't watching every face that passed. Because he was. Mikhail was always watching. It wasn't just survival, it was hope. He couldn't say why, maybe because there was still some faint flicker of belief that someone would one day stop. Not to pity him, but to know him. He had no memory of parents, no faces in his dreams, no half-formed lullabies, no ghost of a mother's touch. The only piece of his beginning he carried was a tattered piece of cloth, a scrap of pale fabric from a baby's blanket, yellowed with age, with a stitched capital D on one corner and a faded number, 07.03.20X. The year was smeared. He had no way of knowing if it was his birthday, but it was all he had, and so he kept it folded in the inner pocket of his hoodie like a relic. He didn't remember who first called him Mikhail. Maybe it had been a volunteer at the first shelter, or a worker at the orphanage. He'd kept the name because it felt like something he could carry, something solid, even if the world around him wasn't. He had once been in a group home. Once. That life, though brief, had left deeper bruises than winter ever could. He'd learned quickly not to trust the smiling faces of adults who promised safety. He'd learned that sometimes other kids were the cruelest of all. He had run, slept in parks, stolen apples, taken beatings, learned to vanish at the sight of uniforms. And somehow he had lasted. But yesterday had changed everything. He didn't know how to explain it. He had been sitting on the sidewalk, same corner as always, holding the same sign in his numb fingers when he looked up and saw him, the boy in the car. The black SUV was glossy, expensive, windows tinted so dark they looked like mirrors, but the back one had been lowered just enough, and he saw him. The boy looked exactly like him, not a little, not in the way people say strangers sometimes resemble one another. This wasn't resemblance. This was a reflection. The same round face, same broad nose, same high cheekbones, same almond eyes. The boy's hair was neater, his skin cleaner, but it was unmistakable. It had stunned Mikhail so badly he forgot to lower his eyes in time. They had stared at each other. For seconds that stretched like a heartbeat suspended in space, Mikhail felt something shift. It wasn't just the boy's face, it was what was behind it. Recognition. Not of memory, but of something. Connection. As if their skin spoke the same language. And then, as quickly as the car had paused, it had pulled away. He was gone. But Mikhail couldn't stop seeing his own face in that spotless window. Couldn't forget how the boy had looked at him, not with disgust or pity, but confusion, curiosity. It made no sense. He had never seen the boy before. He didn't know any rich people, yet that face was his, or had been. He rose from his cardboard bed, brushing off bits of gravel from his knees, and stretched the numbness from his fingers. Today, he would return to that corner. He had to. It wasn't just hope now. It was urgency. He had to see the boy again. Had to know if he was real. The city was waking. Mikhail moved quickly, dodging people and trucks, lipping through alleys, climbing fences to avoid being seen. He stopped at the back of the bakery and waited. Sometimes the girl there left out day-old pastries in a crate. Today, there were only 2 half-burned croissants. He took them gratefully and kept walking. When he reached the corner by the boarded laundromat, he sat down in his usual spot, placed the sign beside him, looked ahead, waited. An hour passed, then another. People walked by, some fast, some slow. A woman told him to get a job. A man muttered something about cleaning up the streets. A college student dropped a sealed water bottle beside his leg without looking at him. Mikhail barely noticed. His eyes were searching the road, waiting for a flash of black paint and tinted windows. For that face. It didn't come, but the feeling didn't go away. Something had shifted inside him, a question had been planted, and it rooted itself like a weed in his chest. Who was that boy? Why did he look like him? Why had no one ever told him there could be someone else? When the sky began to darken again, and the chill returned, Mikhail rose. He didn't want to go back to his shelter behind the store. He wasn't ready to return to silence. Not yet. He wandered. The city at night was a different place. Neon signs buzzed like insects. Drunken laughter spilled from bars. Trash rolled across sidewalks like tumbleweeds. Mikhail wandered past high-rise buildings with doormen and polished lobbies, watched silhouettes of families eating dinner through massive windows. He stopped near one such building. It had a private elevator, mirrored panels, gold lettering on the door, and a guard in a black suit. Mikhail stared at it, heart twisting. He would never belong there. And yet, something in him said he should. His hands clenched at his sides. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow he would go again. The boy had seen him once. Maybe he would return. Maybe he wanted to understand too. The wind picked up again. Mikhail pulled his hoodie tighter and walked back to his corner, each step heavy with uncertainty. But that night, when he curled onto the cardboard under the broken awning, he didn't dream of being warm or full or rich. He dreamed of 2 boys. Same face, different worlds, and the thread that might still connect them. Donye lay awake the entire night, the weight of what he'd seen resting heavily on his chest. It was not the usual restlessness that sometimes followed a stressful exam or a scolding from his father. It was something deeper, something electric and aching. The boy's face, dusty and desperate, was still burned into his mind like the imprint of a bright light behind closed eyelids. No matter how many times he turned over in bed, pulled his blanket tighter, or tried to distract himself with mental arithmetic exercises, the image persisted. Those wide, familiar eyes, the same crooked left eyebrow, the jawline that matched his own. It was impossible, and yet it was the most real thing he'd ever seen. By morning, his resolve was set. He needed to find the boy. He needed answers. He had never done anything like this before. Nothing unsupervised, nothing spontaneous. His life had been charted like a ship's course on an admiral's map. School, piano lessons, debate team, etiquette class, charity events, repeat. Every hour accounted for, but something inside him had cracked open, and what spilled out was not fear, but the overwhelming need to know the truth. He waited until after breakfast. His mother had already left for the capital, and his father was in a meeting at the home office, yelling at someone over a muted speakerphone. Harriet was in the garden, watering the orchids. Donier told the maid he was going to the library room for reading hour and slipped away, his heart pounding as he stuffed his coat pockets with the few dollars he had and one of the protein bars from the kitchen drawer. He took the old bike from the garage, not his usual gleaming carbon fiber one, but the scratched-up blue cruiser he had learned to ride on years ago, less suspicious, less noticeable. The city air was cool, but not cruel, the way it often was before noon. Donier pedaled with uncertain speed, his polished school shoes knocking against the pedals as he retraced the route from 2 days before. At each stoplight, his stomach knotted tighter. This was madness. What was he hoping to find? What if the boy wasn't there? What if it had all been a dream, a trick of light or emotion or imagination? But then he turned the corner by the shuttered laundromat and froze. The boy was there. He sat cross-legged near the wall, the same battered sign beside him. His head was tilted down, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. He looked thinner than Donier remembered, more fragile somehow. The sight sent a strange jolt through Donier's spine. Relief, disbelief, and something else he couldn't name. He parked the bike and approached slowly, his heart pounding against his ribs like a fist on a locked door. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the water bottle he'd brought, and placed it gently beside the boy's feet. The boy lifted his head. Their eyes met again. Time slowed. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at each other, and the silence was so deep it felt like a wall between them and the rest of the world. Donier finally found his voice, though it came out softer than intended. "I saw you the other day," he said. The boy nodded once. "I saw you, too." They studied each other, cautiously, as if afraid that speaking too loudly would shatter whatever fragile thread had bound them in that first instant. Up close, the resemblance was even more startling. Donier felt like he was looking at himself through some distorted time machine, what he might have been if born into a different life. The boy's skin was the same deep brown, but dusted with city grime. His curls were flattened beneath a dirty hood, but their shape mirrored Donier's own. Even their ears tilted the same way. "Do you have a name?" Donier asked. The boy hesitated, then answered, "Michael." Donier nodded slowly, uncertain what to say next. "I'm Donier." Michael gave a half-smile, more wary than warm. "You don't look like you belong around here." Donier flushed slightly, realizing how out of place he must look in his tailored coat and clean face. "I don't," he admitted, "but I had to come back." Mikhail's eyes narrowed a little. "Why?" Donier looked down at his own hands, then back up. "Because you look like me. Exactly like me." Mikhail gave a short laugh, more out of disbelief than amusement. "Yeah, I noticed that too." They sat in silence for a while, the city flowing around them like a stream avoiding two stones. Donye handed Mikhail the protein bar, and Mikhail accepted it without thanks, but with visible need. He unwrapped it slowly, like it was something sacred, and took small bites as if afraid to finish it too quickly. "Do you have parents?" Donye asked carefully. Mikhail's chewing slowed. He swallowed before answering. "No, not that I know of. I was found near a subway entrance, in a box. Just me and a blanket." Donye's throat tightened. "A blanket?" Mikhail reached into his hoodie and pulled out a small, folded scrap of fabric. It was yellowed and frayed, but still intact. He handed it to Donye. Embroidered in one corner was a faint capital D and a faded number. Donye felt the breath leave his lungs. "I have a baby blanket," he whispered, "from when I was born. I've seen it. It looks exactly like this. My name starts with D. This is my birth date." Mikhail pulled the fabric back and stared at it, as if seeing it for the first time. "I always thought it meant something, but I never knew what." Donye's mind was racing. He thought of the ultrasound image, the two shapes, the way his parents never spoke about his birth, the way his mother always seemed too cautious when he asked about when he was born. "I think we're brothers," he said finally. Mikhail blinked. "What?" "Not just brothers," Donye clarified, his voice trembling. "I think we're twins." Mikhail scoffed, but his face betrayed something else. Longing, fear, hope. "That's crazy." "I know," Donye said, his hands clenching. "But I have proof. I found an ultrasound at home. There were two babies. My mom always said I was the only one, but I saw it." Mikhail stood up abruptly. "Why would your parents lie? Why would I end up here if we were both born to them?" "I don't know," Donye replied, standing too. "But I need to find out. I want you to meet my mom." Mikhail stepped back, his face suddenly hard. "No way. I don't do adults. They lie. They send you away. I'm not going back to any home." "I'm not trying to trap you," Donye said quickly. I need her to see you, to see what I saw. Maybe she knows something, maybe she doesn't, but we won't know unless we try." Mikhail hesitated, eyes darting around like he was preparing to run. "You're really rich, huh?" Donye nodded slowly. Mikhail rubbed his hands together. "Then you don't understand what it's like out here. People promise things. They leave. They steal. You want to play detective? Fine. But don't expect me to believe I've got some mom in a mansion who didn't even look for me." Donye didn't argue. He only nodded. "I wouldn't believe it either, but I want to believe something. And I want you to come with me. Just once. We don't have to tell her anything. Just let her see you." Mikhail didn't reply. He looked away, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "I brought you some clean clothes," Donye said after a pause, reaching into the bag strapped to his bike. "They're mine. I thought maybe you'd want to look less suspicious if you came with me." Mikhail looked at the bundle, then at Donye. The tension in his body slowly eased, and he reached out. "Okay," he muttered, "but just this once." They agreed to meet again the next afternoon. As Donye biked home, heart racing, mind tumbling over 1,000 questions, he didn't notice the pair of eyes watching him from a parked black car across the street. Inside the vehicle, Jonathan Brooks sat in silence. His lips were pressed in a thin line, and his fingers drummed once, slowly, against the leather steering wheel. Something had been set in motion, and he knew with cold certainty that it could not be undone. Donye had never felt this kind of anticipation before. Not on Christmas Eve, not before a birthday, not even the night before his first speech at the school debate championship. This was different. This was urgent and messy and confusing, and it made his stomach twist and his hands tremble whenever he sat still for too long. Ever since he returned home the evening before and locked himself in his room, he hadn't stopped rehearsing what he was going to say. How do you ask your mother if she gave birth to 2 children when she's only ever spoken of one? How do you tell her you met a boy on the street who looks just like you, who might be your brother, your other half, the missing piece in the puzzle you never knew was incomplete? He hadn't spoken a word to his father. Jonathan Brooks had emerged from his office late in the evening and given Donye a distracted pat on the head before retreating upstairs with a glass of wine in hand. Donye had watched him go with a sense of rising dread. His father was a master of control and secrets. Donye didn't trust him. Not anymore. So he waited for morning, then for mid-morning, then for the exact window when Audriana would be home between a fundraising breakfast and her next appearance downtown. He knew her schedule better than his own. Harriet had once told him he had a mind like a clock, and it was true. He used that clock now. At exactly 11:30 a.m., Donye appeared in the breakfast nook, where Audriana was sipping black coffee and skimming an iPad with one perfectly manicured finger. She looked up with mild surprise. "Sweetheart, you're not in class?" "I asked for independent study today," he said, not lying but not quite telling the whole truth. "I have a project, for school, about urban inequality. I want to interview someone." Her smile tightened. "That's very civic-minded of you, darling." He took a deep breath. "He's already outside." Her hand froze mid-scroll. "Who?" "My interview subject." She set the iPad down carefully, like it had become fragile. "Donye, you can't just bring strangers to the house without permission. I didn't bring him inside. He's in the garden. You can meet him first." Audriana glanced toward the window. Her expression was unreadable. "What kind of project is this?" "I just want you to see him. Please, Mom." There was a silence, heavy and assessing. Then she nodded once and rose from her chair. The garden behind the Brooks estate was more like a curated landscape than anything spontaneous. A sculpted fountain murmured near a patch of imported flowers. White wrought iron benches curved around perfectly trimmed hedges. It was tranquil and self-contained, designed to impress and isolate. Mikhail stood awkwardly near one of the benches, wearing the clean jeans and sweatshirt Donye had given him, his hands deep in his pockets, his eyes moving constantly, scanning for danger. Audriana stepped out onto the stone path in her cream-colored suit and heels, her posture straight, her face composed. Her gaze found the boy instantly, and stopped. Her lips parted, and for a moment she didn't move. The wind stirred her hair and the sunlight caught her cheekbones, but her body remained perfectly still. Mikhail turned slowly, and their eyes met. The world seemed to tilt. She took one step forward, then another, until she was standing directly in front of him. Her eyes roamed over his face with growing disbelief. She reached out, then stopped herself, then reached again, her fingers trembling slightly, as if afraid he might disappear. Mikhail didn't flinch. He stared back at her with guarded eyes, but something in them softened as she leaned in closer. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Mikhail," he replied. She drew in a sharp breath and placed a hand over her mouth. Donye stood nearby, watching, his heart thudding. Audriana looked at him. "Where did you find him?" "He found me," Donye said quietly. "On the street. I didn't believe it at first, but look at him. Look at us." She did. She looked back and forth between them as if trying to force her eyes to lie, to pretend this wasn't happening. But the truth was there in every angle of their faces, every shadow and curve, her son's. She staggered slightly and sat down on the bench, one hand bracing herself against the cool metal. Mikhail watched her warily, but didn't back away. "I had a dream," she said, as if to herself. "A recurring dream, for years, that I was holding two babies, and then only one. I thought it was just grief. My husband told me I was wrong, that I imagined it. The hospital said there was only one birth." Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. "But I always knew. I felt it. There was someone missing." Mikhail said nothing. He looked at the ground. Audriana turned to Donye, her composure beginning to crack. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't know what to say. I only found out 2 days ago. But I saw an ultrasound picture, Mom. There were two of us. You never told me. Why?" "I never saw two," she said numbly. "I was sedated for most of the labor. They told me you were early and I needed emergency surgery. They said there was one healthy boy and nothing else." Mikhail looked up. "They lied to you." Adriana's breath hitched. "Or they lied to all of us." Just then, the heavy sound of leather shoes on stone signaled another presence. Jonathan Brooks stepped into the garden, his face unreadable, his suit perfectly pressed. He paused at the sight before him. The two boys, his wife sitting between them, her expression raw. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone too smooth. Adriana stood, something steely returning to her posture. "You tell me, Jonathan." He glanced at Mikhail, and a flicker of something passed through his eyes. Then it was gone. "Who is this child?" Donye stepped forward. "He's my twin. We're twins. You knew, didn't you?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "That's absurd." "I saw the ultrasound," Donye said. "There were two of us. He has the same birth blanket, the same birth date, the same face." "Coincidence," Jonathan said coldly. "And I don't appreciate you sneaking strangers onto the property." "He's not a stranger," Adriana said, her voice sharper now. "He's my son." Jonathan's lips thinned. "You're confused. This is emotional manipulation. He probably heard about us, studied your son's face, and decided to take advantage of it." "He didn't come to us," Adriana said. "Donye found him. And you," she stepped toward him now, eyes blazing, "you've always shut me down when I tried to talk about that night. You said I was weak, that the medication was clouding my memory. But I remember enough. I remember the nurse who wouldn't meet my eyes. I remember you taking the paperwork. I remember your cold reassurances. What did you do, Jonathan?" He held her gaze. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Then he turned without a word and walked back into the house. Adriana exhaled shakily and looked at Mikhail again. "You're staying here tonight?" Mikhail's eyes widened. "I don't—" "You're staying," she said gently but firmly. "I don't know everything yet, but I know what I see. And I've seen you before, even if only in dreams." She opened her arms. Mikhail hesitated, then stepped forward. Donye watched as his mother embraced the boy who was, by all appearances, his mirror image. His brother. And for the first time, the garden behind the Brooks estate felt like something more than curated beauty. It felt like home, a real one. But somewhere inside the house, behind locked doors and shuttered secrets, a storm was gathering. And the truth was still only beginning. The house was unnaturally quiet the next morning, the kind of silence that doesn't settle with peace, but stretches thin with tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Donye awoke early, his mind still tangled in the events of the previous day. For a long moment, he remained in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to replay everything: his mother's shock, Mikhail's wary silence, his father's denial, and that one unspoken truth that now pulsed through the walls like a hidden current. He rose slowly, dressed without calling Harriet, and padded barefoot down the long hallway. The floor beneath him, usually warmed by underfoot heating, felt colder today, or perhaps it was just the unease growing in his chest. He paused at the guest room where Mikhail had spent the night. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, he found his brother sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed in the same clean clothes from the day before, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers tightly interlocked. Mikhail looked up but didn't speak. Donier stepped inside, sat beside him, and waited. "They brought me orange juice," Mikhail said finally. "In a glass, not a bottle. Real glass." Donier didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded. "I drank it too fast. My stomach started hurting. I guess I'm not used to that kind of food." "You'll get used to it," Donier said, but his voice held more hope than certainty. Mikhail shook his head. "I don't think I'm supposed to be here." "You are." "No. This place, it's not for people like me." Donier turned to face him. "But we're the same." Mikhail didn't reply. His eyes wandered to the tall window, where sunlight was beginning to filter through the curtains. "You ever wonder if it's better not to know something?" "All the time," Donier admitted. "But now we know." "Yes," Donier said, and his voice carried the weight of it. Their quiet was broken by a soft knock on the doorframe. Audriana stood there, her expression worn but composed, her hair swept back, eyes softer than usual. "Boys," she said gently, "come downstairs. We need to talk." They followed her to the parlor room, the one they rarely used. It was filled with antiques and thick books that smelled of dust and forgotten afternoons. Jonathan Brooks was already there, standing near the tall fireplace, his posture straight, his eyes cold and unreadable. Donier tensed. He felt it immediately. His father had not softened overnight. Audriana sat in the large armchair and motioned for the boys to sit opposite. Jonathan remained standing. "I've made some calls," she began, voice calm but firm. "I've contacted Dr. Patel, my former OB-GYN, and requested the full hospital records from the day you were born, Donier. I've also reached out to a geneticist." "Is that necessary?" Jonathan interrupted, his voice clipped. "Yes," she said, looking up at him with a controlled fire. "It's very necessary." Jonathan said nothing. "We're going to get answers," she continued. "We're going to confirm this with science. But I don't need DNA to tell me what I already see." Jonathan stepped forward. "I understand this is emotional, but we must be cautious. What if this boy is manipulating us? People do strange things when they see an opportunity." "He's 11 years old," she snapped, "and he's been living on the street." Donier couldn't stay quiet. "Why won't you just admit what you did?" Jonathan looked at him sharply. "Excuse me?" "You knew," Donier said, standing now. "You were at the hospital. You handled the paperwork. You silenced Mom. You kept everything buried. Why?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Sit down, Donier." "No," he said, "not until you tell the truth." Audriana placed a calming hand on Donier's arm. "Let me—" She turned to Jonathan. "I want to know, too. I've let you run this family, control the narrative for over a decade, but no more. If you know something, you will say it now." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jonathan turned away from them, staring at the mantel. His voice, when it came, was low and heavy. "You were in labor for 36 hours. The doctors said there were complications. One child was delivered naturally, the other via emergency C-section. He wasn't breathing. He paused. None of them moved. They told me he was gone, that there was nothing to be done. Audriana's eyes widened. No one ever told me that. I didn't want you to grieve something you never remembered, he said. You were unconscious. I thought, what good would it do to tell you there had been another? But he wasn't dead, Audriana said, voice rising. He's sitting right there. Jonathan turned. I don't know how. I only know what they told me. I signed the documents. I never saw the second baby again. Mikhail sat frozen, his eyes locked on the floor. Donye's fists were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. You didn't question them? Audriana asked. You didn't ask for proof? I was overwhelmed, Jonathan said. You were barely alive. I didn't know what to do, so I did what I thought was best. You let me believe I was crazy for all these years. I protected you from grief. No, she said, standing now, her voice breaking. You protected yourself from discomfort. Jonathan looked at Mikhail. I didn't abandon you. But someone did, Mikhail said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Audriana took a step toward Mikhail. We're going to find out what happened. I promise you, and you'll stay here until we do. Jonathan said nothing. His expression had hardened again. I'll stay, Mikhail said softly, but I don't trust him. Audriana didn't argue. The following days unfolded with cautious normalcy. Mikhail stayed in the guest room. He ate at the table, though never with ease. He explored the house slowly, as if expecting doors to slam or people to yell. Donye stayed close, trying to show him the rhythm of their world, how breakfast worked, how the media room lights turned on, which remotes were for what. They even played a video game once, the two of them laughing awkwardly when Mikhail somehow won, despite never having held a controller before. Audriana threw herself into research. She made calls, read old hospital logs, visited the medical archive center herself. The more she uncovered, the darker the truth appeared. The hospital had since closed. Several staff members were no longer reachable. But there were discrepancies in the files, missing signatures, altered timestamps, a nurse's name scratched out in ink. One night, Donye found her in her study, surrounded by open folders and photocopied documents. They sold him, she said, her voice hollow. There was a black market adoption ring. Infants declared stillborn were being trafficked. High-risk mothers were targeted. They thought I wouldn't question it. Donye's stomach turned. Who? A nurse, maybe more. Maybe someone in administration. We don't know yet, but it was real. Why him? Because we were wealthy. They knew one child would be enough for the birth certificate. They knew the father would cover things up. She looked at her son, tears in her eyes. They knew Jonathan would be too proud to ask questions. What do? We bring it to the light. That night, Donye told Mikhail everything. The next morning, the house was not silent. It buzzed with the energy of motion. Lawyers arrived, investigators. A DNA test was expedited, and it came back positive. Mikhail and Donye Brooks were twins, not metaphorical, not emotional, biological, undeniable. Mikhail said nothing when he saw the result. He only stared at it for a long time and then folded it neatly into his pocket. That afternoon, Audriana called for a press conference. The truth was going public. The mansion's gates, once symbols of wealth and division, would now open wide to reveal the cracks beneath the surface. But Jonathan Brooks was nowhere to be found. He had packed a suitcase early that morning and disappeared. The days that followed Jonathan Brooks's disappearance were swallowed by chaos. At first, it was a ripple. The house, usually regimented in its routines, shifted into something unsteady. Security guards paced longer hours. Audriana barely left the study, fielding phone calls, meeting with attorneys, working with investigators. Donye and Mikhail, now brothers in more than speculation, remained mostly in the East Wing, shielded from the flood of incoming media attention and the low murmur of staff speaking in hushed, uncertain voices. Then the ripple became a wave. News stations caught wind of the DNA results. A leaked photo of the test, 2 names, 1 match, hit the front pages of morning outlets and exploded across digital feeds. Headlines screamed scandal, and by mid-afternoon, vans from national news networks were parked along the private road outside the Brooks estate, their cameras aimed like weapons at the gate. Donye stood at his bedroom window, peering out through the gap in the curtain. He could see the press clustered like birds on wire, long lenses pointing, microphones bobbing. They were hungry, and he was beginning to understand why. His family wasn't just wealthy, they were a symbol of success, of power, of image. And now that image was cracking, spilling truth like blood onto marble. He turned away and looked at Mikhail, who was sprawled on the floor, absently flipping through an old issue of National Geographic. "They won't stop," Donye said quietly. "They never do," Mikhail replied without looking up. Donye sat beside him. "Are you okay?" Mikhail shrugged. "I don't know what that means anymore. Okay, compared to what?" Neither spoke for a moment. Then Mikhail said, "Your dad, he's really not coming back? He ran. Because of me?" "No," Donye said, "because of what he did." It was more than fear that had driven Jonathan Brooks away. It was exposure. Audriana's investigation had unearthed not just the truth about Mikhail's disappearance, but a deeper, uglier rot. Financial records that didn't match. Offshore accounts connected to private hospitals. A hidden ledger tucked behind a wall panel in Jonathan's study revealed years of quiet payments, settlements, payoffs, silent transactions tied to medical facilities and adoption intermediaries that had long since vanished or dissolved. It wasn't just about hiding a child. It was about profiting from a system that buried them. Audriana confronted it head-on. She called a press conference not to beg for sympathy, but to draw the battle line. Standing before the cameras in a tailored navy blue suit, she spoke with clarity and fury. She confirmed the twin boys' relation. She condemned the hospital. She detailed the early evidence of systemic corruption, naming names where possible, demanding answers where not. She acknowledged her own blindness and vowed to make restitution, not only to Mikhail, but to any family who might have suffered a similar loss. Behind her, Mikhail and Donye stood silently. The world now knew their names, their faces, their connection. "I was told I had only one son," Audriana said, her voice firm. "I have 2, and I will not rest until justice is done, not just for us, but for every voice that was silenced." The speech triggered a storm. Lawsuits, arrest warrants, hospital administrators called to testify. A nurse, retired and living in Florida, under a changed name, was brought in for questioning and broke down after hours of denial, revealing a network that had trafficked infants under the guise of neonatal mortality. The ring had operated in secret for over a decade, protected by red tape and silence, exploiting the grief of mothers in vulnerable conditions and the greed of men like Jonathan. But the empire was crumbling now, piece by piece. For Donye, the fall of his father was a strange, silent grief. There was no funeral, no final moment, only the echo of absence. He walked past the study and saw the empty chair, the undusted shelves, the aura of something hollowed out. And yet, he didn't miss him. Not the version who had lied, who had chosen pride over truth. Still, he wrestled with the shame of once admiring him, of calling him a hero. For Mikhail, it was different. He had no memories to reconcile, only the strangeness of now being known. The public attention unsettled him. He flinched at cameras, retreated from curious questions, avoided looking at the TV when news anchors debated his life like a courtroom case. Audriana arranged for a private counselor to visit the estate, someone soft-spoken and patient. Mikhail barely spoke in the first 2 sessions, then asked in the third, "If someone throws you away, how do you know you're worth keeping?" The counselor didn't rush the answer. She just nodded and let the silence hold him. Gradually, Audriana began to make changes in the house. The portraits on the central staircase were replaced. Jonathan's face was removed from the family gallery. New photos were taken, of the boys together, of the 3 of them in the garden. She brought in community organizers to help Mikhail adjust, tutors who understood trauma, and volunteers who helped turn his room into something he could choose: a desk for sketching, a window seat for reading, shelves for worn sneakers, and secondhand comics he found in a nearby bookstore. One night, as the sun dipped behind the estate's iron fence, Mikhail asked to go into the city. Audriana hesitated, then agreed. They went together, with Donye in tow, to the corner where Mikhail had once sat with his cardboard sign and broken hope. The bench was still there, the wall still stained. He stood there for a long time, staring at the spot. "I used to sleep right here," he said softly. "I used to dream about someone finding me. Not rescuing, just finding, just seeing me." "You were always visible," Audriana said. "It was we who were blind." When they returned that night, the mansion didn't feel so vast. It felt like a home trying to heal. But the consequences of Jonathan's flight still rippled. International authorities had issued a warrant. The media speculated on his whereabouts. A tip placed him in Zurich, then Brazil, then possibly Morocco, none confirmed. Audriana hired private investigators, but focused her energy on the system he left behind. The boardrooms, the contracts, the trusts, the hidden clauses. One by one, she shut them down. Donye watched her with a mix of awe and worry. She had become a warrior, but he knew the toll it took. He began helping where he could, writing letters, giving statements, even testifying in the preliminary hearing against the retired nurse. Mikhail didn't testify. He wasn't ready. But he sat in the front row, eyes steady, when the charges were read. Summer gave way to fall. The leaves changed, and so did the household. Harriet no longer called Donye young sir, but addressed both boys equally. Mikhail laughed more now. He started school in September, private but low profile. He wasn't hidden anymore, just protected. Donye was always nearby. The two didn't become best friends overnight. They argued, they misunderstood each other. But they kept showing up. They played, they ate, they sat in silence when words weren't enough. And then, one evening, as Audriana walked into the garden, she found them beneath the fountain, passing a comic book back and forth, the same frame held open on both laps. She smiled. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was real. The empire had collapsed, but from its ruins, a family was finally forming. The first time Mikhail wrote his full name on paper, he hesitated halfway through the second letter. It was a small moment, almost invisible, but Donye saw it. They were sitting side by side at the long mahogany table in the library, once reserved for Jonathan Brooks's strategic meetings and investment calls, now repurposed into a quiet study space where the boys often did their homework. Mikhail had been tasked with completing a form for school registration, the last box asking for full legal name. He had written the first 4 letters in sharp, deliberate strokes, M-I-K-A. Then his pen slowed. His brows furrowed slightly, and the grip on his pen loosened. After a few seconds, he resumed, scrawling the remaining letters quickly and then quietly setting the pen down. He didn't speak. Donier leaned over to look and saw what he had written. Mikhail B. No last name. "You know you can write Brooks now," Donier said gently. Mikhail didn't answer. He stared at the paper, then looked away, eyes fixed on the antique clock ticking in the corner of the room. Audriana entered a moment later, carrying a stack of folders. When she saw the form on the table, she paused, reading the unfinished name with a flicker of recognition. She set the folders down and came around the table, kneeling beside Mikhail's chair. "You don't have to rush it," she said, her voice low. "A name isn't something you borrow. It's something you choose." Mikhail glanced at her, then at Donier, whose face was open, patient, waiting. "It doesn't feel real," Mikhail murmured. "Like, maybe if I write it down, it makes everything permanent. And I don't know what that means yet." Audriana nodded. "It means you belong, but only if you want to." He didn't answer then, but the next morning, when the same form sat waiting, Mikhail picked up the pen and wrote the name in full. Mikhail Brooks. That single act, though simple, seemed to shift something in the air, as if the house, long filled with echoes and secrets, was now finally breathing out the last of its ghosts. By winter, the media storm had quieted. Legal proceedings continued, but out of the public eye. The nurse who had confessed to falsifying records received a formal sentence. Several lawsuits were filed against the former hospital's parent corporation. Investigations opened in 3 other states. Audriana provided testimony to a federal ethics committee and was working to establish a nonprofit dedicated to reforming maternity care for vulnerable families. Jonathan Brooks remained at large. There were reports of sightings in Europe and Asia, grainy images that led to nothing concrete. Interpol had issued a red notice, but no arrests had been made. For Audriana, the hunt for her husband-turned-fugitive had transformed from rage to resolve. She no longer cried at night. She no longer waited for phone calls. Her energy had been refocused on building something better, something worthy of the boys she was raising. The house reflected that change. The once sterile halls had grown warmer. Art created by local children now lined the walls. Donier's piano playing drifted through the corridors more often. Mikhail added plants to his room, tended them like quiet companions. Even the kitchen, once the domain of silent staff, had become a shared space. Harriet had taught the boys to make banana bread. Their first attempt was nearly inedible, but no one minded. Mikhail had begun to write. Not essays or stories, but letters. To himself, mostly. Sometimes to his mother. Once to his father, folded tightly and placed under his mattress without explanation. Donier never pried. He had his own way of processing. Through logic, through quiet observation, through long walks around the state where he talked aloud to no one in particular. One afternoon, they visited the courthouse. Not to testify or stand as witnesses, but for something quieter, more personal. A judge, a woman with silver hair and a kind face, welcomed them into chambers. Audriana stood tall in her navy coat, flanked by her sons. Her hand gently squeezed Mikhail's shoulder as he stepped forward with the clerk. "I'd like to make it official," he said. "Mikhail Donier Brooks." The name was spoken clearly, without tremor. The clerk smiled and stamped the papers. The judge nodded and offered her congratulations. When they exited the building, the wind caught Mikhail's coat and lifted it like wings. Later that evening, they had a quiet dinner at home. No celebration, no champagne, just a meal, warm and shared. As they sat around the table, Mikhail looked across at Donye. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Donye smiled. "Not in a million years." "Do you ever miss the way things were?" Donye thought for a moment. "No, not really. It wasn't whole. I just didn't know it yet." Mikhail nodded slowly. "I used to think I was the broken part." "You weren't," Audriana said firmly. "You were the part that was stolen. And now you're home." He didn't reply, but the softness in his eyes said enough. By spring, things had settled into a rhythm. The boys attended the same school, though in different classes. They shared chores. They argued over music. They took turns picking movies. Sometimes they stayed up late whispering in the dark, swapping stories from their separate childhoods like pages from parallel novels. And then, one day, Mikhail asked if he could visit the shelter where he used to sleep. Audriana went with him. So did Donye. They brought donations, blankets, food, books, but more than that, they brought presents. Mikhail sat with a younger boy who reminded him of himself and listened without interrupting. He didn't offer false promises. He simply nodded. That evening, he told Audriana he wanted to volunteer once a week. "I don't want to be saved," he said. "I want to be useful." "You already are," she told him. A few weeks later, the nonprofit officially launched the Second Light Foundation, named for the child who was never meant to be lost. Audriana gave a speech at the opening, her voice steady, her story clear. But it was Mikhail who drew the standing ovation. He didn't say much, only a few sentences delivered quietly, but with a gravity that pulled everyone in. "I was invisible for a long time. Not just to strangers, but to people who loved me without knowing I existed. I don't blame them. But I know now what it means to be seen, and I want that for every kid who's still out there waiting." The applause was long and honest. Afterward, the three of them stood together, looking out at the room full of people who believed in something better. It was not the end of a story. It was a beginning. The mansion, once a symbol of exclusivity and secrecy, now hosted workshops, art programs, and healing sessions. The gates stayed open, the garden bloomed, the fountains sang. And sometimes, if you stood very still on the lawn, you could hear the sound of two boys laughing, identical in voice and spirit, building a world that was finally theirs. A name for both. A future that belonged to them equally. A family whole. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video and explore others on the channel. And share this one with someone who needs to see it.